Semen retention, the alchemist's seed, turning sexual energy into spiritual gold. There was a time when I believed my strength came from what I could show the world, from action, achievement, and movement. But in the silence of my own discipline, I discovered that the real power of a man is not found in what he gives away to the world, but in what he learns to contain within himself. I realized that the seed of life is more than flesh and biology. It is consciousness, vitality, the very essence of creation itself. When I learned to master this force, instead of being mastered by it, everything changed. The world slowed down, my mind sharpened, my emotions became stable, deliberate, and anchored in something unshakable. I began to understand that what most men lose in moments of indulgence, the masters of old preserved as sacred gold, the very currency of their power. Retention became my alchemy, my transformation, the process through which raw desire was refined into clarity, purpose, and dominance over my own nature. This is not about suppression. It is about transmutation, the art of redirecting primal fire into creative flame, turning lust into light, and energy into expression. In the beginning, I struggled. The modern world does not reward patience, nor does it honor restraint. We are surrounded by stimulation, by endless temptations that promise satisfaction but deliver exhaustion. Every screen, every image, every fleeting pleasure is designed to pull energy outward, to scatter focus and weaken will. But when I chose to retain, to hold my seed, my essence, my creative potential, I felt an unfamiliar resistance rise within me. It was not the body rebelling, it was the ego, afraid of losing its old habits of escape. I realized that true strength begins where comfort ends. And in that discomfort, in those first difficult days, I started to sense a new kind of fire awakening inside me, the fire of self-command. At first, it was subtle. My focus deepened. My thoughts became clear and sharp, cutting through distractions like a blade through fog. Work that once drained me now energized me. Conversations became more intentional, movements more deliberate, and my presence began to carry a quiet intensity that others could feel, even if they couldn't name it. This was the birth of what I call the golden aura, the magnetic field that forms around a man when his energy is full, unbroken, and consciously directed. It's not arrogance or vanity. It's the unmistakable glow of integrity. The calm confidence of a man whose power radiates from within rather than being borrowed from external validation. Retention taught me that discipline is not deprivation. It is preparation. Every urge resisted became energy reclaimed. Every moment of restraint became a moment of strengthening. What I once thought of as a battle against temptation turned out to be a dialogue with my own energy, a negotiation between my lower nature and my higher purpose. And in that dialogue, I discovered that energy seeks expression. If you don't give it direction, it will find one for you, through distraction, anxiety, lust, or frustration. But when you channel it consciously, it becomes creative genius, focused action, and inner composure. As weeks turned into months, I noticed transformations that could not be denied. My sleep improved, my voice deepened. My eyes carried a different kind of intensity, not aggressive, but alive, as though light itself had settled behind them. People responded differently. They listened when I spoke. They leaned in when I entered a room. Women sensed something primal, yet contained, as if the wildness that drives desire had been domesticated into confidence, tamed but not weakened. I realized then that energy speaks before words do. Retention had given me command over a frequency that most never master, the frequency of embodied awareness, of silent power that does not need to prove itself. And yet, beyond the physical and social effects, the real transformation was internal. I began to experience my thoughts as currents of energy rather than random noise. I could feel inspiration rising from the same reservoir that once produced lust, the same force that drives procreation, I now use for creation in my work, my art, my leadership, my vision. The alchemist seed became my metaphor for this process, the turning of raw, primal energy into refined spiritual gold. Just as the ancient alchemists sought to turn base metals into precious ones, I was learning to transmute instinct into awareness, passion into purpose, and pleasure into presence. This was not a theory, it was a lived truth. In time, I saw clearly that retention was a mirror of the mind. It reflected my fears, my habits, my attachments. Every temptation that surfaced was a teacher, revealing the parts of me still enslaved to impulse. I realized that most men are not truly free, not because they lack opportunity, but because they lack control over their own energy. They are driven by cycles of stimulation and depletion, constantly chasing an illusion of satisfaction while unknowingly draining the very power that could fulfill them. Retention breaks that cycle. It forces you to slow down, to feel the energy rather than release it, to direct it upward rather than outward. And in that simple reversal, a man's entire life changes trajectory. From reactive to proactive, from scattered to centered, from seeker to sovereign. The more I practiced, the more I began to see the pattern, that semen retention was not simply about withholding an act, but about mastering an entire way of being. Every time I resisted the pull of indulgence, it was as if I tightened the reins of my own mind. I became the rider, not the horse. In this act of control, something ancient awakened, a wisdom that felt older than the modern world itself. I began to understand why sages, monks, warriors, and inventors across history spoke of conserving the seed as the foundation of their strength. It wasn't superstition, it was science before science had language for it. Energy stored is energy transformed. What once flowed downward through habit now began to rise through intention, feeding thought, creativity, and will. I could feel the current moving upward, a surge that sharpened my senses and deepened my awareness. In a world where distraction is the new addiction, focus has become the ultimate superpower. Retention gave me that. My attention stopped scattering across trivial pursuits. My mornings became sacred. My nights became peaceful. There was no fog of exhaustion, no dullness from overindulgence. My mind became a lens, clean and clear, focused on what mattered. Work that once took hours now took minutes, because I was fully present, body, mind and spirit, aligned toward one direction. I stopped chasing external stimulation because I had discovered an internal source of energy that made me self-sufficient. This, I realized, was true wealth, not the accumulation of things, but the mastery of one's internal resources. And yet, I also saw how dangerous this energy could become if mishandled. When retained, but not directed, it could stir restlessness, aggression, or pride. I had to learn the art of transmutation to consciously move the energy through breath, movement, and creative work. Exercise became sacred ritual. Meditation became my crucible. Every time I wrote, worked, or created, I was transforming desire into productivity. Every sweat, every breath, every focused action was part of the alchemical process. Through this discipline, I learned balance, not suppression, but redirection. To suppress is to stagnate. To channel is to evolve. There came a point where I no longer viewed women as objects of desire, but as reflections of energy itself, mirrors that revealed where my consciousness still wavered. Attraction didn't disappear, it refined. I could appreciate beauty without being enslaved by it. I could sense desire rising, and instead of reacting, I could observe, breathe, and harness it. This shift was profound. It redefined what intimacy meant to me. It was no longer about possession, but about presence, about meeting another being from fullness, not from lack. Retention taught me that when a man stands complete within himself, he does not seek to take, he radiates, and by radiating, he attracts naturally. The modern world teaches men to consume images, pleasure, validation, but not to create. We are taught to react, not to master. Through retention, I saw the architecture of that conditioning and began dismantling it piece by piece. Every impulse became an opportunity to prove my sovereignty. I understood now that energy is not meant to be spent aimlessly. It is meant to be invested into learning, building, leading, loving, and serving a higher purpose. When I treated my energy like gold, life began to mirror that value back to me. Opportunities appeared, synchronicities aligned. People noticed my shift, though they couldn't explain it. What they felt was the coherence of energy that comes only when a man lives in alignment with himself. There is something magnetic about self-control, not the rigid kind born of fear, but the fluid kind born of understanding. The more I retained, the more I realized that power is not loud. It doesn't need to shout. True power is silent, grounded, and centered. It moves through presence, through stillness, through the way one breathes, speaks, and stands. I noticed that people began to mirror my energy. Where I was calm, situations calmed. Where I was focused, outcomes aligned. Retention had become my invisible armor, not to block the world, but to harmonize with it from a position of inner authority. In this journey, I also encountered loneliness, the kind that comes when you walk a path most do not understand. There were moments when I questioned everything. Why deny what nature made pleasurable? Why go against the current of an age that glorifies indulgence? But each time doubt arose, I remembered the difference between nature and nurture. Nature gives us energy. Nurture teaches us how to waste it. The practice of retention, I realized, was not rebellion against nature, but a restoration of it. The way the body was designed to conserve, build, and channel power upward when guided by conscious will. The seed, when preserved, becomes not a burden but a beacon, illuminating paths that indulgence will never reveal. As I continued, my emotional landscape transformed. Anger softened into resolve. Anxiety dissolved into focus. What once triggered me became fuel for understanding. Retention had rewired my nervous system. I no longer reacted instinctively to provocation. Instead, I responded with awareness. I felt like a man reborn, not because I had added something new to my life, but because I had reclaimed what was always mine. My energy, my time, my attention. These are the true currencies of power, and every man who learns to guard them becomes rich beyond measure. Over time, I began to see retention as a sacred art, an alchemy that fuses the physical with the spiritual, the mundane with the divine. It is not a punishment or a rule. It is a process of remembering what we were always capable of. When I learned to hold my seed, I was holding my potential. I was holding the blueprint of creation itself. The same energy that gives life to worlds. The same current that fuels stars. To waste it unconsciously was to diminish my own connection to that creative source. But to channel it with purpose was to align myself with the rhythm of existence. To become, in essence, a co-creator with life itself. There came a time when I no longer needed to force the practice. It had become natural, as though my body and mind had synchronized with a higher rhythm. Retention stopped being a discipline and became a state of awareness. It was not about counting days or resisting urges. It was about living in alignment with energy itself. I had crossed the threshold where what once felt like effort now felt like flow. The energy within me no longer fought for release. It sought expression through purpose. I could feel it rising through me like a current of light, turning instinct into insight, tension into creativity, and desire into drive. It was as if my body had become a living engine for transformation, constantly recycling and refining energy into strength, clarity, and inspiration. In that state, I began to perceive how most of society functions on depletion. People rush through life, drained by endless cycles of stimulation, caffeine, screens, social approval, sexual release, yet they wonder why they lack vitality. I had lived that way too, always reaching outward for a spark that could only come from within. Retention reversed that flow. Instead of leaking energy, I began storing it, and with storage came expansion, not just physical endurance, but mental spaciousness. I could think for hours without fatigue, work with focus that bordered on meditative, and feel emotions deeply without drowning in them. This was not willpower, it was chemistry aligned with consciousness. My entire being had recalibrated to operate on a higher frequency. Still, I knew this power demanded responsibility. Retained energy magnifies whatever you are. If you are angry, it makes you angrier. If you are disciplined, it makes you unstoppable. It's a mirror, not a mask. So I learned humility, the understanding that energy, no matter how powerful, must serve awareness. I meditated daily, grounding the energy, refining it through breath and reflection. I spent long walks in silence, allowing the inner current to settle into balance. I came to realize that the goal was not to dominate the energy, but to dance with it, to move in harmony with the creative intelligence that flows through all living things. The alchemist's seed was not about control, it was about communion. In this communion, creativity exploded. Ideas came effortlessly, as if whispered by an unseen muse. I could sit for hours, writing, designing, building, with no sense of time passing. It felt like being plugged into an infinite source. That was when I understood that sexual energy is not just biological, it is cosmic. It is the same life force that fuels art, innovation, leadership, and love. By conserving it, I was not depriving myself. I was aligning myself with the creative pulse of existence itself. Every great innovation, every profound work of art, every movement that shifts history, all of it arises from this same source, directed and refined by those who learn to channel rather than consume it. But there was another layer, still deeper. Retention began to transform how I perceived masculinity. The world tells men that power is domination, aggression, and conquest. Yet in this practice, I found the opposite. True power is not what conquers others. It is what conquers the self. It is the stillness of knowing you could act, but you choose restraint. It is the strength to hold energy without needing to discharge it for relief. It is patience under pressure, clarity in chaos, and the quiet authority of someone who knows his value does not depend on validation. I began to embody a different kind of masculinity, grounded, creative, compassionate, and focused, one that didn't need to take, because it already possessed. The irony of retention is that the longer you practice, the less you think about sex, not because desire disappears, but because it transforms. What was once an instinct to chase pleasure becomes an awareness of energy circulating throughout your being. It is as if the polarity of attraction, once directed outward, now orbits inward, feeding your heart, your mind, your vision. You start to feel a subtle connection with all of life, the rhythm of the breath, the pulse of the earth, the flow of time itself. Sexual energy becomes spiritual energy, not because you reject the body, but because you embrace it as a vessel for consciousness. In that union of matter and spirit, you begin to live in what the ancients called the golden state, where inner peace and external power merge into one seamless expression of being. At this stage, I began to sense a kind of aura, not mystical, but palpable. People noticed it before I did. They would say, "There's something different about you," though they couldn't describe it. I felt it as coherence and invisible harmony between thought, emotion, and action. I no longer leaked energy through distraction or conflict. Everything I did was integrated. I spoke less, but with more weight. My gaze carried calm intensity. My gestures became minimal but deliberate. It was as if every cell in my body was synchronized toward a single, unified vibration. And that vibration drew things to me, opportunities, respect, love, not through manipulation, but through magnetism. That is the golden aura, the radiance of retained, refined, and directed energy made visible through presence. In this state, even challenges transformed. Obstacles became mirrors of growth. I no longer feared failure because I saw it as feedback, energy redirected, not wasted. My confidence no longer came from outcomes but from alignment. When your energy is full and your intention is clear, the world reflects it back to you. You stop chasing success and start embodying it. That is the paradox of retention. The less you seek, the more you attract. The less you grasp, the more you receive. For what you hold within becomes what you project outward, and the world, in turn, responds to that vibration. There is an elegance in this discipline, a timelessness that transcends fashion or culture. Men throughout history, from saints to scientists, warriors to artists, understood this secret. They guarded their vitality not because they were afraid of pleasure, but because they valued purpose. The seed, to them, was sacred, the essence of life itself. In conserving it, they conversed with the divine. They turned lust into light, impulse into invention, and desire into destiny. I now understand why. For when you master your energy, you master your world. The deeper I journeyed into retention, the more I understood that this practice was not about suppression, it was about liberation. I had spent years believing that to be free meant to indulge in every desire that rose within me. Yet, what kind of freedom is that, if you are constantly pulled by urges beyond your control? True freedom, I realized, is mastery. It is the ability to choose where to direct your energy, how to respond rather than react, when to move and when to stay still. Every day of retention refined that mastery within me. The mind became sharper, emotions steadier, intuition clearer. I began to sense that retention was not only physical discipline, it was spiritual alchemy, the art of turning the densest human instinct into the purest form of consciousness. There were days, of course, when the old impulses resurfaced, waves of raw desire, almost too strong to contain. But even those moments became teachers. I would breathe deeply and feel the energy rise, traveling up the spine like a silent flame. Instead of resisting it, I observed it, the pulse, the heat, the rhythm, until it softened into stillness. Over time, that fire became familiar. It was no longer the enemy, it was the forge. The very force that once tempted me toward weakness was now shaping my strength. I learned that energy cannot be destroyed or denied, only redirected. And when you redirect it consciously, it becomes your ally, your muse, your invisible armor. One evening, while meditating in silence, a realization struck me with crystalline clarity. Every man carries within him two destinies, one of release, one of refinement. The first path is common, celebrated, and loud. It promises pleasure, validation, and escape. But the second path, the path of refinement, is quiet, solitary, and sacred. It promises transformation, not comfort. Few walk it, yet those who do change the world. Retention, I realized, was never meant for everyone. It was the art of the few, the seekers, the creators, the builders of civilizations. The alchemist's seed was never just a metaphor. It was a living practice that could elevate a man from instinct to insight, from lust to legacy. As I embodied this philosophy, my relationships transformed. Women sensed something different. Not a chase, not an emptiness seeking to be filled, but a fullness that radiated presence. There was no need to impress or pursue. Energy did the speaking. It's strange when you stop craving validation. Attraction deepens naturally. My gaze no longer sought approval. It conveyed certainty. My silence carried weight. This wasn't manipulation or game. It was magnetism, the kind that arises when a man knows himself and no longer trades his power for momentary relief. Retention taught me that masculinity is not in dominance, but in direction. It's not about controlling others, but about mastering one's own current. As weeks turned into months, something subtle, yet extraordinary occurred. The separation between physical and spiritual energy began to dissolve. Every thought, every breath, every heartbeat felt charged with vitality. The body was no longer a vessel to be indulged. It was a temple, humming with creative intelligence. Work became effortless. Speech carried conviction. Even in silence, I could feel a kind of vibration within a hum of life that seemed to speak in a language older than words. This was not just biology, it was metaphysics. Retention had awakened in me an awareness that energy is sacred currency, and the way we spend it shapes the architecture of our destiny. I began to look at modern life through a new lens, one that made me question everything I had been conditioned to believe. The constant stimulation of social media, the endless pursuit of pleasure, the normalization of indulgence, all of it seemed like a grand distraction designed to drain human potential. Retention exposed the invisible economy of energy, in which most people live bankrupt, spending vitality on temporary satisfaction while neglecting the fortune within. The true wealth, I realized, was not money or status, but retained life force, refined, directed, and invested in purpose. The more I conserved it, the more the world opened to me opportunities, insights, synchronicities, as though the universe responds to those who preserve what it gave them most sacredly, their own seed of creation. Through all this, a deep reverence took root within me. for my body, for life, for the unseen intelligence that orchestrates existence. I understood why ancient sages treated the seed as divine essence, why warriors practiced celibacy before battle, why artists spoke of inspiration as a living force. They all touched the same truth, that creation is not born of excess but of concentration. When energy gathers, it crystallizes into greatness. And so, I began to live deliberately, each action infused with awareness, each word spoken with intent. Retention became not a practice I did, but a way of being I embodied. With this awareness came responsibility. I could no longer waste time, attention, or emotion on things that diluted me. Gossip, lust, distraction, they now felt heavy, almost toxic. I began to guard not just my physical energy, but my mental purity. For what good is retention if the mind remains scattered? Every moment became an alchemical decision, to rise or to regress. I learned to filter my inputs, what I watched, whom I spoke to, what thoughts I entertained. Each choice was a signal to my energy field, shaping the frequency I carried, and that frequency, in turn, shaped my reality. This was true alchemy, not in laboratories of metal, but in the crucible of consciousness. And yet, in all this elevation, I stayed human, feeling flawed, evolving. Retention was not a cure-all, it was a mirror. It revealed both my power and my weakness, my potential and my shadows. Some days, I fell. Some days, I rose higher than ever. But the beauty of the journey was in its rhythm, in the oscillation between striving and surrender. For even the alchemist must burn through his impurities before gold can emerge. In that burning, I found truth. That semen retention, at its highest form, is not abstinence but awareness, not denial of life, but deeper participation in it. It is the art of holding one's light steady in a world addicted to flicker. The transformation was not sudden. It was gradual, like dawn breaking after a long night. My habits refined, my focus sharpened, and my purpose solidified. I no longer feared temptation because I understood it. It was simply energy in disguise, asking for direction. I no longer chased meaning, I radiated it. The seed I once sought to protect had now become my compass, my fuel, my silent teacher. And in that state, I finally understood. The true alchemist does not seek gold outside himself. He becomes it. The longer I walked this path, the more I felt that something ancient had awakened within me, something primal, but not primitive. It was the awareness of being both the creator and the creation, the sculptor and the stone. My desires no longer pulled me outward. They began to spiral inward, feeding the furnace of my own becoming. In that furnace, identity melted and was reforged. I was no longer a man chasing validation, pleasure, or dominance. I was a vessel through which energy flowed upward, refined, purified, radiant. Every time I withheld release, it was not repression but refinement. I could feel the energy transmuting, not just metaphorically, but biologically, neurologically, spiritually. It became light in my mind, calm in my heart, and power in my presence. People began to respond differently to me, though I said nothing about what I practiced. There was something in my eyes. They said, a steadiness, a focus, a mystery they couldn't quite name. It wasn't charm, it was coherence. The body emits signals when it is whole, when energy is circulating rather than leaking. Retention gave me that wholeness. My posture changed, my breath slowed. Even my voice carried a new gravity, as though each word had been weighed in silence before being spoken. This wasn't about ego, it was about energy alignment. I had become like a tuning fork vibrating at a higher frequency, and those attuned to truth could sense it instantly. Through this energetic coherence, creativity flourished. I found myself writing, building, envisioning, expressing in ways I never had before. The same fire that once sought release in moments of lust now expressed itself through art, insight, and action. I began to see that creative power and sexual power were one and the same, both born from the same source, both meant to manifest something higher. When you withhold the raw material of creation and refine it through awareness, it re-emerges as inspiration, luminous, focused, unstoppable. This was the alchemical secret hidden in ancient texts, encoded in myth and symbol, that the seed, when preserved and raised, becomes the philosopher's stone, the inner gold that can shape destiny itself. There were moments when I sat in deep stillness and could feel my entire being humming with vitality. It was as though life itself had become audible. Every breath carried a resonance, every heartbeat a rhythm. In that silence, I felt a connection not just to my own potential but to the universal current that moves through all things. Retention had thinned the veil between the personal and the cosmic. I began to understand that energy. When mastered becomes awareness, and awareness, when deepened, becomes unity. This was not mysticism for its own sake. It was lived experience. To contain is to concentrate, and to concentrate is to connect with the intelligence that underlies creation itself. As this awareness grew, so did a quiet humility. I saw how easily power could become pride, how subtly energy could inflate the ego. Many men who touch this force become intoxicated by their own potency, mistaking the current for the self. I learned to remain grounded, To remember that the seed does not belong to me. It flows through me. It is life's own rhythm, entrusted for a time, to be guarded and guided wisely. That understanding kept me centered, not as a master of energy, but as its steward. Retention had not made me superior. It had made me responsible, and in that responsibility, I found peace. It is strange how the external world mirrors internal mastery. As I refined my energy, opportunities began to align without force. Conversations flowed, work accelerated, relationships deepened. It was as if the universe began to recognize me as a stable vessel, capable of receiving and transmitting greater currents of life. The seed had become signal, a frequency of order in a world of noise, and those who vibrated with chaos either fell away or were transformed by proximity. That was the silent influence of retention, not to dominate others, but to elevate the field in which you stand. To lead not through control, but through coherence. The more I lived this truth, the clearer it became. Retention is not about rejection, but redirection. It is not about fighting against desire, but about befriending it, understanding it, guiding it. For desire is not the enemy. Ignorance is. When you know how to work with energy, you stop fearing temptation. You see it as potential waiting for purpose. I realized that the sexual force was never meant to be wasted, nor was it meant to be shamed. It was meant to be used consciously, creatively, reverently. When that shift occurred in my mind, retention ceased to feel like discipline. It became devotion. Each day became an act of alchemy, each moment a choice between scattering and centering. I learned to channel my energy through breathing, movement, prayer, creation. Every time I resisted the impulse to dissipate, I gained a new layer of power, not aggressive, but magnetic. And that magnetism began to draw toward me the very things I once chased in vain. Clarity, purpose, abundance, peace. That is the paradox of the alchemist's path. When you stop grasping, you begin receiving. When you stop consuming, you start radiating. The world bends not to your will, but to your vibration. The more I ascended into this practice, the more I realized that retention was never just about sexual energy, it was about awareness itself. At first, I thought I was controlling my desire. Later, I discovered I was refining my consciousness. What I had once called lust was only the raw vibration of life seeking to express itself. When I gave it form through awareness, it became creativity. When I gave it silence, it became insight. When I gave it purpose, it became destiny. I began to see that the energy I once feared was sacred intelligence blind, only when left untamed. To master it was not to suppress nature, but to synchronize with its higher rhythm. I was not denying life's force, I was learning its language. As days turned to months, I started noticing patterns that transcended logic. The more I conserved, the more I attracted opportunities, synchronicities, people aligned with my evolution. It was as though retention tuned me to a subtler frequency where manifestation operated effortlessly. The mind, once restless, had become a precise instrument, cutting through distraction with quiet precision. My inner dialogue grew quieter, yet my outer reality responded faster. I began to sense that retention was not a linear act of control, but a cyclical law of return. What you keep within gathers density, and what gathers density eventually reshapes reality. The universe rewards containment with coherence, and coherence with creation. I found parallels everywhere in physics, in spirituality, in art. Energy, when compressed, releases unimaginable force. The same law applies within us. When desire is compressed through discipline, it transforms into will. When will is focused through purpose, it becomes radiance. I understood then why ancient alchemists worked in secrecy, not because they feared persecution, but because they guarded the sacred mathematics of transformation. Semen retention, I realized, was that same alchemy hidden in human biology, nature's invitation for man to become divine through self-mastery. And every act of restraint was not denial, but transmutation, turning lead into gold, flesh into light. The golden aura people sometimes spoke of was no myth. I began to feel it subtle at first, then undeniable. It wasn't visible like a flame, but tangible like warmth. It was the condensation of ordered energy around a disciplined being. People could sense it instinctively. Some were drawn to it, others repelled by it, but none could ignore it. This was not arrogance, it was magnetism born from inner symmetry. When energy ceases to leak, it gathers, and when it gathers, it radiates. I realized that this radiance is what makes certain men unforgettable, even in silence. It's the essence behind presence, the unspoken language of mastery. In that state, my perception deepened. I could see the subtle exchanges of energy that governed human interaction. Every conversation, every glance, every word was a transaction of frequency. Retention sharpened this sensitivity. I could sense when someone was drained, when another was grounded, when attraction was more energetic than physical. The world had become transparent, not in a mystical way, but in a deeply perceptual one. I understood why sages spoke little words, often disrupted the precision of vibration. Sometimes, silence communicates more power than speech, because silence carries compressed meaning, while speech often leaks it. Retention made me fluent in silence. I began to treat every action as a ritual, leading, walking, speaking, all done with deliberate awareness. Each movement either squandered or sanctified energy. I found that the simplest acts, when done consciously, nourished the seed of power within me. Food became fuel, breath became prayer, thought became architecture. I no longer lived reactively, I lived alchemically. Every choice became an equation. Will I rise or will I dissipate? That awareness created a sacred rhythm to life, one where each day felt purposeful, each hour charged with quiet potency. The more I lived this way, the more ordinary life began to feel extraordinary. And yet, the deeper I went, the humbler I became. Because the energy, though powerful, was not mine. It was life moving through me, and my only task was to channel it wisely. To misuse it was to disrupt harmony. To hoard it without expression was to stagnate. True mastery, I learned, lies not in holding forever, but in releasing consciously through creation, compassion, purpose. Retention without transmutation is repression. Retention with awareness is evolution. The goal is not to store endlessly, but to refine continuously, so that every breath, every thought, every act becomes a sacred expression of contained fire. I realized that this fire, the alchemist seed, was never meant to make me ascetic or detached. Its purpose was integration, to unite spirit and matter, heaven and earth, desire and discipline. The balance of those forces is where wisdom lives. I stopped seeing myself as divided between spiritual and physical. I began to see both as expressions of one current. The energy I once sought to conquer had become my teacher, showing me that to rise higher, I must also root deeper. To transcend, one must also inhabit fully. Retention was not about escaping the world, it was about engaging it with refined consciousness. Now, when I look at the world, I see men chasing what they already possess, the power they leak daily, in moments of forgetfulness. I do not judge them, I was one of them. But I also know that within each man lies a sleeping alchemist, waiting to awaken, waiting to remember that creation begins with containment. We are all vessels of the same sacred current, but few remember how to hold it, how to guard it, how to raise it. When that remembering occurs, everything changes, not just the man, but the field around him. Retention is not just personal mastery, it's planetary healing, one conscious man at a time.